All right, so we can answer this question. What does he mean? Sounds like something that somebody would say today. It sounds really modern. When a man thinks of himself, that it is which determines or rather indicates his fate. Sam, what do you think? I mean, the thing about Thoreau, you can even take it out of context. It doesn't really change what he's talking about. So, what do you think he means?
Like, it means basically like what you think of yourself. Like, that's like if you think of something like positively, you're probably gonna have a positive outcome. But then like if you basically are what you speak of yourself.
Well, that's exactly what he said.
Existence from it.
I mean, that's exactly what he's saying. That what is it? It indicates not only your present, where you are in life, but where you're going. Do you believe that? Okay. I like what he says. Is it the tyranny? The public opinion is a weak tyrant compared with our own private opinion. So what you do think about yourself is more probably significant in your life than what others think about you. I think that's true. All right. Thank you. I do think we need to read. Yeah, we need to read the next one. So Madeline.
The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. What is called resignation is confirmed desperation. From the desperate city, you go into the desperate country and have to console yourself with the bravery of minks and muskrats. A stereotyped but unconscious despair is concealed even under what are called the games and amusements of mankind. There is no play in them, for this comes after work. But it is a characteristic of wisdom not to do desperate things.
What does he mean by that? The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. And then he says, what wisdom does not do desperate things. You ever thought of what desperate means? I really think that's an important skill. Please don't overlook. You may think you know what a word means, and sometimes you know you don't know what it means. But if you have access to a dictionary, every now and then, particularly when you're analyzing something, look it up. You may not really know what it means, and that's key here. So what does it mean to be desperate? Did you have something, Carolyn?
Well, it's like you're willing to do anything at this point. Like you've sunk so low that you're kind of at your wit's end of what to do.
Yes, we've looked it up, and that confirms that it's like the last thing you can do. It's the last thing you do, and usually you do it without any hope of success. You know, it's a desperate measure. Maybe there's a teeny bit of hope in there, otherwise you wouldn't do it at all, but you really don't think it's going to work. What does he mean most people are like that? Most people are like that. They're down to their last opportunity to do something, and they're just shooting it in the dark. Kieran, he thinks most people are like that. Figure out why do you think he says that? And you may or may not agree with that, but in what way or you think people are like, what does that look like if people are like that? They're down to their last, they act like they're down to their last, they're hopeless, desperate.
Maybe they're just like waiting for something to happen, but they don't say it. They don't express desperation.
What kind of life would that be if you live that way? Like this is kind of the way you live. It's like everything, you're just always desperate for something.
Miserable.
It would be awful. He already talked about penance. You know, he sees people at 1845. I mean, life is not easy in America in 1845 for a lot of people, but it sounds like everybody is miserable. At least he looks around and he sees that. By the way, you wouldn't know that by looking at Facebook or whatever you look at. I mean, do people ever put anything negative about, look at me, I'm in the hospital with a broken leg? Do they put that in the Facebook? Or this is my son's report card from ninth grade, look and see all the F's there. I mean, nobody ever puts negative information, right? Is that a place to share negative information? So, I mean, we're all kind of lying because we have lots of negative things, but we're not going to tell other people. Anyway, desperate, let's see, I think we can skip. So I'm gonna ask you to skip, to page, 14, no, let me, wrong page. All right, page 10, all right, bottom of the page. This is question number 7, and we're gonna even skip within this to, he basically, up to this point, his argument has been, what are the basic, he's looking for the basic things to live, physically live. Most of his philosophy is minimize the physical and emphasize the spiritual or the metaphysical, whatever you want to call it. And so he's trying to figure materially what are the 4 things I need to live with, and he makes that decision here. So, May, would you, by the words, let's see, is that where we are?
My books
Yeah.
in my locker.
All right, well, I don't know, you can look and see if there's another one. How about Daniel?
By the words necessary of life, I mean whatever of all that man obtains by his own exertions, have been from the first or from long use, has become so important to human life, that few, if any, whether from savageness or poverty or philosophy, ever attempt to do without it. To many creatures there is, in this sense, but one necessary of life. Food, to the bosom of the prairie, it is a few inches of palatable grass, with water to drink, unless he seeks a shelter of the forest or the mountain shadow. None of the brute creation requires more than food and shelter. The necessaries of life for man in this climate may, accurately enough, be distributed under the several heads of food, shelter, clothing, and fuel. For not till we have secured these, are we prepared to entertain the true problems of life with freedom and a prospect of success.
Okay,
Man-
I'm sorry, I want you to keep reading, but let's stop there. We can answer number 7, basically. What are the 4 necessaries?
Food, shelter, clothing, and fuel.
And notice how he qualified that, in this climate. And he goes on to describe in some climates, fuel, except for the inner fuel that is created by your food, is unnecessary. In fact, in some climates, clothing is unnecessary. But in the climate that he's in, clothing and fuel are definitely part of it. Food and shelter, I don't think anybody would argue with. And so, remember what his point is if I can figure out how to procure these 4 things at its most minimal, then I can really live life, because those aren't what we're living for. And what he's arguing is that everybody he sees is living for those 4 things. Think about it. Food, do you live to eat, or do you eat to live? You know, he would say you eat to live. You don't live in order that you can eat more. You eat just in order for you to live. So food, shelter. What kind of shelter are you going to live in? Is it, how many rooms do you really need? How big do you really need? What a big mortgage do you really need? Clothing. We all have more clothes than we ever need. We don't even wear them. You know, they're just hanging there. I can't get rid of some. Like, if I throw this away, I just might need it, so I just better keep it. And I don't need to keep it. You know, I got 6 other shirts that look just like it, maybe a different color. But it takes up room, but I just can't seem to get rid of it. And then fuel would be heating, cooking. So those are the basic things. Remember, the purpose is, if I can have those at a minimum, I can focus on the higher laws, which Daniel's going to keep reading. He's going to talk a little bit about these necessary.
Man has invented not only houses, but clothes and cooked food, and possibly from the accidental discovery of the warmth of fire and the consequent use of it. At first a luxury, arose the present necessity to sit by it. We observe cats and dogs acquiring the same second nature. By proper shelter and clothing, we legitimately retain our own internal heat. But with an excess of these, or of fuel that is, with an external heat greater than our own internal, may not cookery properly be said to begin? Darwin, the naturalist, says of the inhabitants of Tierra del Fuego that while his own party, who were well clothed and sitting close to a fire, were far from too warm, these naked savages, who were farther off, were place when this is too rapid, or for want of fuel, or from some defect in the drought, the fire goes out. Of course, the vital heat is not to be confounded with fire, but so much for analogy. It appears, therefore, from the above list that the expression animal life is nearly synonymous with expression animal heat. For all food may be regarded as a fuel which keeps up the fire within us, and fuel serves only to prepare that food or to increase the warmth of our bodies by addition from without. Shelter and clothing also serve only to retain the heat thus generated and absorbed.
You probably think, as I do sometimes, he's overdoing it, that I get it. And he analyzes it down to, like, I'm looking for the essentials. Yeah, I thought his example was great when Darwin went to Tierra del Fuego. The Europeans were sitting close to a fire with coats on, and their teeth were chattering because they were cold. The people who lived there were standing further away from the fire with very little on and were sweating. So the absolute necessities are dependent upon where you live. And his point is to get to those higher things. I actually think that I'm going to ask this question, but I don't think we need to read anymore in this chapter. But the question is, what's wrong with luxuries? He makes this comment. He says, the wisest have ever lived a more simple and meager life than the poor. Why do the wisest people that ever lived? I don't know who you would put in that category, but, of course, Christ, the prophets. What about Plato, Socrates before him? Why do some of the wisest people live the most simplest lives? Why do they live almost like with very little money? Why do they choose to live that way? So that should give us pause to think, if the wisest people ever lived, they kind of choose to be poor, then why are us, who would probably agree we're not as wise as those people, why are we going after bigger and better? Maybe there's something unwise about that. Another question is, he talks about necessities versus luxuries. We all like to pamper ourselves at some point. We like luxuries. But luxuries, by definition, are excessive, right? It's extra. Why are we pursuing the luxuries that would take us away from the most important things in life? And remember, this is from a non-Christian. Well, he's not a non-Christian. I don't know what he is, but he's not a biblical person. He doesn't really quote scripture all that much and so forth. But he would agree that spiritual things are more important than physical things. So why are we spending so much time pursuing the physical things when those aren't as important as the spiritual things, which we spend less time pursuing? That's kind of where he is. And that's why the goal is to get to the chapter called Higher Laws. And he talks about that very thing. Like our minds should be up here, which I am going to make this executive decision. You get a taste of what he's getting at, so we're going to actually skip a little more and turn to the second chapter in the book, called Where I Lived and What I Lived For. It's a shorter chapter, but we're still going to kind of skip around here, and I've got some questions that will help us do that. Thank you. Page 66.
It's not.
I turn to 66. I think that gives us a hint. Anybody else need one? All right. So turn to 66. Why don't we go to That it's where I lived and what I lived for. And you got the questions, we're gonna match them up. And why don't we start here and work our way back? So, page 60, what I lived for. Sam, you wanna get us started?
Ray said 66.
Yes.
At a certain season of our life, we are accustomed to consider every spot as a possible site of a house. I have thus surveyed the country on every side within a dozen miles where I live. In imagination, I bought all the farms in succession, for all were to be bought, and I knew their price. I walked over each farmer's premises, tasted his wild apples, discoursed on husbandry with him, took his farm at his price, at any price, mortgaging it to him in my mind, even put a higher price on it, took everything but a deed of it, took his word for his deed, for I dearly loved to talk, cultivated it, and him to some extent. I trust and withdrew when I had enjoyed it long enough, leaving him to carry it on. Give me the whole.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
This experience entitled me to be regarded as a sort of real estate broker for my friends. Wherever I sat there, I might live, and the landscape radiated from me accordingly. Always a house, but a seat. Better if a country seat. I discovered many a site for a house, not likely to be soon improved, which some might I have thought too far from the village, but to my eyes the village was too far from it. Well, there I might live, I said, and there I did live, for an hour, a summer and a winter life. Saw how I could let the years run off, buffet the winter through, and see the spring come in. The future inhabitants of this region, wherever they may place their houses, may be sure that they have been anticipated. An afternoon sufficed to lay out the land into orchard, woodlot, and pasture, and to decide what fine oaks or pines should be left to stand before the door, and whence each blasted tree could be seen the best advantage, and then I let it lie. Fallow perchance for a man is rich in proportion to a number of things which he can afford to let alone.
I don't know if you followed his reasoning, but the whole book is leading up to buying a house. Literally, he buys the house and takes the house in pieces to Walden Pond and puts it back together again. So it's a cabin, I bet a quarter of this room, I think, or smaller. But he talks about, he would look at houses, he would find out how much they cost, and he wouldn't buy them. So he became sort of a real estate agent for people. He knew all the houses that were for sale, and he'd look at a lot of them, but he never bought any of them. And then he makes a statement at the end of that. He says, for a man is rich in proportion to things that he can afford to let alone. So he was sort of making the principle. I looked at all this stuff, but I didn't buy any of it. And you are rich in proportion to the things you don't buy. What's he talking about? How could you be rich because of what you don't have? That's what he's saying. The less you have, the richer you are. Claire.
Yes.
What does he mean by that? The fewer things you own, the richer you are. You're richer, you see how that works? The less and less, the richer you are.
I mean, like, he doesn't mean like obviously rich in material things, but like what you were saying, how you're like more wise when you own those things. So like your mind isn't completely focused on just material things, and you can
Well, I thought that was, you said that well, really good answer. Anybody wanna elaborate on that? I don't think we could make it too much better, but anybody wanna elaborate? I think of it this way, if I don't want something, isn't that the same thing as, and I'm happy about it, isn't that the same thing as getting it and being happy about it? In other words, if the bottom line is I'm satisfied by not even wanting it, as opposed to I'm satisfied by wanting it and getting it. Aren't those two people in exactly the same place? Does that make sense to you? Like, if you just don't want things, then how could you be dissatisfied with not having them? So he's advocating, let's not want so many things and suddenly become wealthier and wealthier. Because I guess one of the goals would be happiness or satisfaction or fulfillment. And you can get to that same end by being poor as you could being wealthy. And this guy was way ahead of his time. I love the way he thinks. Anyway, let's see. This next incident is interesting. So we'll go back. Claire. He actually does buy a house and doesn't at the same time. It's kind of interesting.
My imagination carried me so far that I even had the refusal of several funds. The refusal was all I wanted, but I never got my fingers burned to find actual possession. The nearest that I came to actual possession was when I bought the Hollow Wolf Lanes and had begun to sort my seeds and collect the materials with which to make a wheelbarrow to carry it on or off with. But before the owner gave me a deed of it, his wife, every man has such a wife, charged her mind and wished to keep it, and he offered me $10 to release him. As to speak the truth, I had but 10 cents in the world, and it surpassed my arithmetic to tell if I was that man who had 10 cents or who had a farm, for $10 or altogether. However, I had let him keep the $10 and the farm too, for I had carried it far enough, or rather to be generous. I sold him the farm for what I gave for it, and as he was not a rich man, made him a present of $10, and still had my 10 cents in seeds and materials for a wheelbarrow left. I found thus that I had been a rich man without any damage of my property, but I retained the landscape, and I have since annually carried off what it yielded without any appearance, with respect to landscapes. I am a
Read the little.
I'm a monarch of all I survey, and my right there is not a dispute.
So somebody want to explain how he almost bought the Hollowell farm? Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so like basically was saying like he sorted his materials and like he came with a wheelbarrow to like buy, but the person selling it to him, like his wife, his wife changed her mind and like said like that they're gonna keep it. So the man that was gonna sell it to him offered him $10 to release him.
So I think he literally bought the thing. He was getting ready to move in, and the wife changed her mind. Wasn't upset with it. In fact, the guy said, "I give you $10. We should give your money back for buying it. And I'm gonna give you $10 extra just for being nice about it." And Thoreau didn't take the $10. He got his money back, but he let him keep the $10. So that's what happened. He almost bought it, and he doesn't seem at all. He says he seemed richer by not having it. But then he makes this comment, "But I retained the landscape." What did he mean by that? Like, he didn't buy the house, but he bought the landscape. He still owned the landscape. What does he mean by owning the landscape? How do you own a landscape when you don't own the actual place? Do you know any place that you really think is pretty, it's really inspiring? Like, you just love this spot, you go by it a lot and you look at it and say, wow. You don't own it, but what do you own? Yeah,
Like your like mental picture.
right. That doesn't cost a thing, and you never give that up. I've always been fascinated by the Greensboro Country Club area. Never lived there in Irving Park, but I always lived around it. A lot of my friends lived on it. I mean, this is old Greensboro money, to be sure. And so I would run through there. When I was a kid, I'd run, when I was in high school, I'd run from Cone Boulevard, hardly Irving Park, although we called ourselves West Irving Park until they built New Irving Park behind Mendenhall. So we, pretty blue collar, but I'd get up in the morning during high school and run up, what is that road? It runs all the way to Cornwallis from Cone, run through the golf course, own the golf course, and sometimes meet a guy there who was on the team, and we'd run actually on the fairways until they ran us off. Usually it was really early. I'm talking about 6 in the morning. And I used to love, it seemed like everywhere I had to go in Greensboro, I had to go through Irving Park, past the big country club, past the big trees and the long fairways and the big houses. And I used to dream what it was like to live there. And it didn't cost me a thing to dream that. And I still think it's a pretty place. I actually know nobody, my wife does, interestingly. She knows somebody who lives there from Goldsboro. But I don't know anybody, I'm sure, anymore that lives there. But it didn't cost me a thing. They're not charging me a bit of rent or mortgage to drive through there and admire that house or that fairway. I've never played golf on it in my life. And yet, I have all those memories. That's Thoreau. Said, think of all the things you own mentally and you can enjoy, doesn't cost you a penny. And it's a lot less trouble than having to buy it, keep it up, pay the mortgage. And I get to go drive past those big houses and say, wow, that's really cool. And it didn't cost me a penny. The person in it, I bet those houses are $1 million houses, you've seen them. You can be just as happy as that guy, and that's kind of his point. You can retain the landscape. You can buy mountain ranges, go up in the mountains, you've bought the landscape. I think that's great. We're getting to the point, I don't think it yet is, it's question number 6, that is Philippians 4:8. What Paul talks about, what you think about, and that's part of the deal, is what do you think about? Remember Wordsworth? Wandered lonely as a cloud, he saw the daffodils, and when he was sad, he remembered the daffodils. This is a very romantic view, that the memory, the things that you collect in your mind, it goes back to what you think of yourself, that really makes who you are. Are you going to be a happy person because you go there all the time, those thoughts? And yet it didn't cost you anything. It didn't cost you a cent, so you don't have the headache of that. I think he's on to something. So we are going to, let's see, we are going to go to, let me find the page number. It's the very next page, but it's the present was my experiment of this kind. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, it's on page 68, turn there, bottom of the page. We're still moving back, okay, Julia?
The present was my next experience of this kind, which I purposed to describe more of it. The convenience the living experience of 2 years ago. As I have said, I do not propose to vote and live to be determined, but to brag as loosely as chain spirit. In the morning, standing on a roof, if only to wake up my neighbors.
Okay, I'm going to actually read the next one too, but we can answer the question number 4. Literally, he spends 2 years there, and the book is written chronologically. So he moves in July of 1845, and he leaves in September of 1847. And so he puts all those experiences into 1 year. So he writes it chronologically through the seasons, but it's for every summer, there are really 2 summers experiences, and for every fall, he includes 2 falls of experience. So that's what he means by that. It's worth reading on your own someday. It's your book, so you can put it in your library. Would you mind reading, Julia? Just the next one is kind of short paragraph.
When first I took up my abode in the woods, that is, began to spend my nights as well as days there, which by accident was on Independence Day, or the 4th of July, 1845.
Okay, just note that. He thinks that's kind of interesting, that his independence from, like, respectable life started on July 4th, Independence Day. You can go ahead.
My house was not finished for winter, so it was merely a
So I don't know what you're picturing, a house, a cabin by the lake? I don't know, what comes to your mind? Yeah, I'd love to have a cabin by the lake. This is his cabin by the lake. Literally 2 people could sit in it. The walls had, like, the boards didn't flush together sometimes, so there's lots of holes in the walls. It's not ready, doesn't have a chimney or a stove, so it's not ready for winter. But when he moved in during the summer, he didn't need all those things. He didn't need a fire. And the wind would blow through the, so he was really, it's more like a tent, and a tent with holes in it, and not much bigger than a tent. Eventually he'll have room for a desk and a chair, there's a stove and a bed. So that's his cabin by the lake. It doesn't have internet, and it doesn't have 2 stories, and it's not a luxury cabin, it's very minimal, which is of course what he was looking for. All right, so I would like for us to turn the page to page 71, and where it says through the view from my door. And this would be question number, I think we can do 5 and 6. We just have, well, we'll just do 5. It's a short paragraph, but Kylie, would you read this one? I got mine on the clock. Through the view of the door.
Though the view from my door was still more attractive, I did not feel crowded or confined in the least. There was pasture enough for my imagination. The low shrub oaks, black oaks, to which the opposite shore road stretched away toward the prairies of the west, and the steppes of Artery, affording ample room for all the roving things of the time. There are no happy in the world that beings to enjoy only a vast horizon.
All right, well, before we go, let's look at that